Hello, everyone. Welcome to the St. Louis Art Museum's Art Speaks program. My name is Jessica Kennedy, and I'm the educator for adult learning at the museum. Before we begin, please familiarize yourself with the Q&A section located on your screen. Feel free to enter your questions at any time during the program, and we will choose a few to answer at the end. Also, there is live auto transcription available for this program. Please click the CC icon to activate or deactivate the subtitles. Today's program, Art at the Confluence, is the second in a series of talks in conjunction with the exhibition Art Along the Rivers, a Bicentennial Celebration, which is now on view at the museum. For this installment, we are joined by Melissa Wolf, Curator of American Art. Thanks for being here today, Melissa.
Thank you. I can be heard and seen now, right?
Yep, you're good.
Perfect, great. It's so odd when you give presentations like this, I just see my screen. I don't see any of you all, but I'll pretend that you're here in my vision. So I'm going to talk today about the first section of a 5-section exhibition, Art Along the Rivers, a Bicentennial Celebration. And as many of you might know, the exhibition was organized in conjunction with the Bicentennial, and it gave us an opportunity to look closer at this regional area's artistic production. And by regional area, hang on here. By regional area, I mean an area that Amy Torbert, my co-curator, and Beth Rubin, the American Department Research Assistant, defined as the Confluence region. And in thinking about the Bicentennial, we thought about the issues of statehood. On one hand, it is bound by an Anglo definition of time, and it's also bound by an Anglo definition of the land. And we really wanted to move outside of that. So we took this opportunity to, number one, go much broader than statehood. So we go back 1,000 years to contemporary, but also to tighten in a little bit to look at just our region of this confluence. And so it runs from the north, from Hannibal, west to Herman, down into the Sikeston area, across the river at the Ohio River, across the Mississippi River at the Ohio and Cairo, and back up along the Illinois side. So that's our region. And we decided, well, a couple of reasons. Number one, we felt like there really hadn't been a good look, a fresh look at the creative endeavors and the artistic endeavors and legacy of this region. We also felt like in picking this confluence region that it was an area that was defined, we call it confluence because it's defined by the confluence of the 3 most powerful rivers in North America, the Mississippi, the Missouri, and the Ohio, and you see those on this map. But also, we wanted to, how do I put this? So this area, defined by these confluences, has a shared history, not so much in the people's experiences necessarily of culture and time, but because we all share the same land. It might be a different landscape, but it is this region and the natural resources and the location that all of us share. And so it felt like a kind of community approach, a kind of gathering together of the people who share our space with us. And so that's why we picked this region. We made lots and lots of road trips. We traveled all over the place. We photographed 3,000 objects. We did not put all 3,000 in the show, but we did put 155 objects, which is pretty impressive, down from 3,000, but it's still lots of different objects. It's also lots of different makers, lots of different media, dates. We borrowed from 24 regional lenders and 36 national lenders, so a very large number of lenders. Our exhibitions department has been very good about accommodating us with that. We also produced a catalog, so I hope you rush to the store and buy that. We also produced an audio guide, and while other exhibitions have audio guides that we've been doing, and I think they're incredibly helpful, our audio guide, because this was so community-based and regional-based, one of the things that we added to the audio guide was interviews of people not part of the museum, but people who had either personal or history or regional relationships to specific objects. And so they talk about either the subject of those objects or the objects themselves. And so I do hope when you come through the show or even online, that you do check out the audio guide, because it's really, really wonderful. It does have the curators talking on it, but it also has other curators from the museum. We laugh in the American department that this is maybe the first exhibition, maybe not, that the St. Louis Art Museum has done that every single curator on staff could talk about an object in the show. So let's go ahead and jump into the first section. As I said, it's a five section thematic section, exhibition, art at the confluence, art on display, art in production, art communities, and art as advocate. And you might, some of you might have tuned in last week when we had Norman Akers talk about his work in the show and sort of an overview of the introduction to the show. And then in the following Thursdays, of course, we will cover each of the 5 sections. So today is the first section, art at the confluence. And what I want to show you here is the map that's in this first section in the exhibition. And this is what we mean when we say confluence. So if you see St. Louis in that sort of mid right-hand side, these are all of the routes. They're not all of the routes, but they are the routes, the rivers, the river routes, the overland routes that all converge on this confluence region that are related to objects in this section. So, you know, it's the Lewis and Clark Trail that goes along the Missouri River. It's the Burlington Railroad. It's the California and Overland Trail. It's the Boonslick Road, which is before even these overland routes, or several of the Osage Nations trails through the areas. So in the 20th century, right, the Burlington Railroad, or Route 66 as well. So it is the convergence of all of these, as well as the convergence of these rivers, as well as St. Louis's location on the eastern side of the Louisiana Purchase in the 19th century. And so being on that eastern edge, it was the gateway or the supplying point more for travels into the western areas of North America, of the United States. So this is why we introduced the exhibition with this first section. So these thematic sections, the confluence, art at the confluence, is also sort of divided by 3 perspectives. So the first perspective is confluence of travel, right? And so you traveling through the areas along these routes. Some of the earliest artists in the show traveled along the rivers. They were what I would say, they attached themselves to either fur trading expeditions or sometimes military expeditions. It still was not an area that you could just set off on your own and travel. And these earlier artists were captivated by, in some ways, the scientific nature of what was then to an Anglo audience unknown. So Audubon comes into St. Louis in the 1840s. He is planning to do a research trip, a gathering trip along the Missouri for his Quadrupeds of America. And so while he's waiting in St. Louis for the ice to break up on the Missouri, he does an image, or this image that you see here, of what he calls say squirrels. Actually, they're the western fox squirrel. But you see this interest in scientific detail. He's articulated, you know, every fur and the anatomy of these 2 squirrels. And yet what makes Audubon so more well-known than many other naturalists is this wonderful sense of animation, you know, the squirrels lifting up to sort of notice what's happened, you know, maybe an acorn's dropped by him or something. So this fabulous sense of animation. Karl Bodmer was also an artist who came to St. Louis. He was a Swiss artist, and he was traveling along with Prince Maximilian von Fied, who was a German prince who was also a naturalist. And so they were going to travel through this you know, this Louisiana Purchase area as naturalists. And so one of the locations, or one of the artists that that Bodmer met, was the Mandan artist and war leader Matotope. And so this is Bodmer's portrait of Matotope. It's a very European style of portraiture, right? We see everything about Matotope, his physiognomy, all of the things he's wearing, you know, accoutrement that has meaning to him. We would recognize him on the street if we saw it. I sort of belabor this point because it gives me a wonderful example right off the bat to sort of talk about how we wanted people to experience this exhibition, visitors or you listening to us, and that is in relationships, in dialogues, not just as individual objects. So Matotope's portrait made by Bodmer is matched with Matotope's own portrait, his self-portrait, which is on the left, painted on a bison hide, which he wore. And rather than what I call the visual literacy, the visual literacy of European derived art is that it looks like, whomever it is that you're doing a portrait of. Whereas the visual literacy, the visual language in the Northern Plains tribes for portraiture was rather narratives, what that person had done. So Matotope gives us 8 scenes of episodes where he showed leadership, courage, bravery, where he showed the actions that gave him the status and the role and made him who he is. So 2 very different languages to convey a portrait. And this is the way in which we want you all to experience the exhibition. As I said, there were very close attention to detail. That's true also of Charles Weimar, excuse me, who was a German artist who settled in St. Louis, and he was painting images of quote unquote the West for an Anglo audience even before he'd ever gone any further west than St. Louis. But, the field was, becoming very popular. And so there were many Anglo artists painting Western scenes. And so he felt like he needed to go west to get a little bit of what do I want to say, to get some more validity maybe than other artists, to get sort of a leg up on them to say that he had actually been in the West and had seen the things he was painting from life. So these are 2 pages from his sketchbook on one of the trips that he took west in 1858, took along the Missouri River. And I show this to you, first of all, because of its attention in detail and specific objects, so that when Weimar came back to St. Louis, he could use these sketches to make his images, which are totally made up, but make his paintings more realistic by making the objects realistic. But I also show you this because I want you to notice the figure on the page on the left, the figure that's in profile. So for the long time, that was just simply an Arikara Indian. We did not know his identity. However, when we showed it to Alex Marr, our curator of Native American art, he felt sure that he could identify him. And in fact, we were able to. Our first clue was the peace medal that he wears around his neck. You see Van Buren written on it, and 1838, 39. 37, that's it. I had to take a good look at it. 1837. And so in going back to the records of who received that peace medal, what delegation did, so we had the names of the Native Americans, the Arikara, who were in that delegation. And then we went to photographs. And what we discovered is that the unknown to us, Native American whose portrait Weimar had painted was an Arikara named Palani Ahahi. And that's pretty close to the correct pronunciation. And I think you can see this from the profile, even though the photograph of him is frontal, you can still really see a very clear physiognomic relationship. So as part of this exhibition, we were able to identify for our audiences one of the subjects for Weimar. Again, on this sort of scientific interest in the area, there are some very early images made by Seth Eastman. Eastman was a career military man. He was stationed in Fort Snelling. He had been trained in topographical drawing at West Point, and in fact, he taught it later on in his career. And you see that in these 2 watercolors of the Mississippi. Eastman had traveled in 1847 down the Mississippi to the mouth of the Ohio around Cairo. He also stayed at Jefferson Barracks in the St. Louis area. And so you see a very close attention to geological formations, to the nature of the trees and their sort of angles of trunks, to the nature of the river. I don't know if the Mississippi was ever actually this idyllic. It would be nice if it was, I don't know. Probably was, since he saw it. But again, in thinking about relationships and dialogues, we can think of Eastman's very careful attention to sort of what he saw. Some narrative detail. I don't know that he saw a Native American shooting ducks on the river. He may have, but certainly the topographical elements of the painting is as close to observation as Eastman could get. Contrast that to this painting by Albert Bierstadt. So Bierstadt, excuse me, Bierstadt worked in the East in New Bedford. It was where his studio was, but he came to St. Louis in order to take off from St. Louis to go on the overland routes to California. He was doing so, like Weimar, to get sketches from the actual site so that he could put them into his paintings to make them more realistic, more believable, more marketable as well. And so, but what we see here, if Eastman is kind of, oh, how have I described it before? Sort of a little melodic tune. Bierstadt is like an aria. It's operatic, it's grandiose. It just makes you want to, you know, go down to your knees and say, "Oh my Lord, look at this nature." You know, a storm is sort of, you know, coming off of the mountains. We see the lake in the middle, the trees sort of, you know, frame our view into this beautiful Edenic scene with lofty mountains in the background. I mean, it just couldn't be any more grandiose. And there's a reason for that. Part of it is that Bierstadt is showing this as completely vacant. It is an Eden, unpopulated, pure, pristine, and this painting just makes you want to walk in there. It makes you want to enter it. It is very, you know, evocative, and part of that is this idea of manifest destiny, which is the term we give to the idea in the 19th century and even into the 20th century, and maybe even a little bit today, that the Anglo settlers in the New World in North America had a divine province, had a divine right to this land, to settle it, because the land reflected qualities in the people who populated it, in the Anglos who were asked to populate it, I guess, in their ideology. And so this just beckons you to come in. Well, this really, what I want to say, shaped people's ideas of what the West was like. You noticed in the Bierstadt, there are no Native Americans or indigenous people. It is unpopulated. And this is a fiction. And what I show you is the photograph above the painting is Bierstadt painting in his studio in New Bedford, people watching on, right? So he's not painting where he sees it. And this is, I think, has a dialogue, has a continuation or a counterpart in Alex Soth's photographs of the Mississippi called Sleeping by the Mississippi. And in this, Soth has gone into a home or a building in Cape Girardeau. And, you know, what we see is the failure of this idea about the American dream, about, you know, a guaranteed success. And so you see a wall where plaques have been fallen off or taken off. There's a sense of loss, of vacancy. And in the middle of that photograph, there is a grandiose landscape like what you see Bierstadt in the Bierstadt painting. But next to it is this tiny little strip of like a newspaper that says folklore. And so what Soth is, I think, getting at is that this was folklore. It was fiction. You know, he sort of unveiling unveiling the fiction of images like Bierstadt and ideas that painting supported. Another contemporary artist, and we do include contemporary artists in the show, whose work either counters or has a dialogue or continues or innovates in some way the historic themes, historic images in the exhibition. That's true of Nick Lowe, who is a contemporary artist in Chicago. So Lowe became interested in James Wilkins's trip from St. Louis on the overland route to the gold areas in 1849. Wilkins was not looking for gold. He was making sketches in order to create a panorama like the one that's in our collection. And so so what you see on the right, or on the left, excuse me, is one of the drawings by Wilkins, and a similar drawing that Nicholas Lowe has made in retracing Wilkins's steps. And Lowe isn't necessarily interested in recreating Wilkins's drawings. Rather, he's really interested in thinking about changes in the land since being populated. How is it redefined? How is it, in some sense, made into a landscape of economy, a landscape of what we call extractive sort of colonialism, of capitalism, of transfer into money, so to speak. And you also see a sculpture that's in the exhibition that's about this. But one of the things that I'm particularly drawn to Lowe's watercolors for is maybe what this shows. And what you see on the top is one of Nick's one of his landscapes that he took of St. Louis at the beginning of his travels west, like Wilkins, but he's standing atop Monk's Mound at Cahokia. And what I like about this is that, to me, it reinforces this idea of why we picked this region, right? As I sort of said, because it's a shared land. What I think of when I'm at Monk's Mound is that I'm walking on the same land, right? On the same area that someone walked in the Mississippi, a Mississippian artist walked 1,000 years ago. But yet in looking across the river, it is a very different view, but it's the same river. When I'm on the levee, I'm walking on the same ground that fur traders walked on, that Osage people walked on as well. And so to me, that is part of the basis of what we wanted, of why we picked and why we shaped the exhibition in the way that we did. Another work that pushes this first perspective into the 20th century is this photograph by Robert Frank. And Robert Frank might be most well known for a series that he did called The Americans. And it is, he's sort of the founder, the creator, the innovator, whatever, of road trip photography, which is now a kind of genre in 20th century photography. And what you see here is not an image that he took when he was doing The Americans, but rather an image he took when he was visiting St. Louis on a fashion shoot for Harper's Bazaar. But he also went along the levee as well and took this photograph. And what I love about it, and what seems sort of an exemplary image for this exhibition, is that, and for this section as well, is that on one hand, it is about movement through the area, right? The train and the blurring of the train, which shows this sort of movement. The scene is on the levee, right? And so it's also this movement of along the waterways and trade and sort of commercial uses of the waterway. But yet there is that figure there sitting, right? And the buildings that have been built. So it's also about stasis, right? About staying and watching. And it's such an incredible image of modern life, of the modern world, right? Where so many things are at so many different speeds at sort of the exact same place, right? There's sort of a permanence and yet a temporality, and the conflation of that into experience that really in some ways defines our modern world or our modern life. It also leads me into our second perspective of the exhibition, and that is this perspective of a confluence of objects. If we had a confluence of routes in our first perspective, here we have a confluence of objects. And that is because of these different routes and rivers. This area was a central area of trade. And so what we're looking at is materials and objects that would travel through this area. The work on the left is a gorget. It would have been worn around the neck. It is from the Mississippian culture. It is made out of lightning whelk shell, which is not from this area. It is actually from the Gulf of Mexico. So this is an object that would have been traded up through the rivers and overland routes into this Mississippian area. The work on the right is a woman, a kneeling woman, and she's holding one of these lightning whelk shells that were very significant to religious practices in the Mississippian culture. But what this woman is made out of is flint clay. And that's a material that is, at least during the Mississippian area, pretty much unique to Cahokia, unique to this particular confluence region. And so when we find flint clay in other parts of the Mississippian world, we know that that came from St. Louis and went out along those rivers. I also love this Mississippian figure because She was unearthed very recently in 2009. And so for me, in some ways, that's again how artists 1,000 years ago are still very close to us in experience. And what you see here is from a video that was taken when literally she was taken from the ground and the person is holding her. See all the mud still on her and everything. And it's just so exciting to me to think of that, that this conflation of 1,000 years, in a lived experience, in our lived world. She was unearthed near Exchange Avenue in East St. Louis, and it was part of an excavation project that was being done pre-construction of the Stan Musial Bridge. And so what I also love about it is how um, on one hand, amazing it is that she's lasted 1,000 years. She's still here with us, right? So the permanence of objects, and yet also their vulnerability. She made it intact through two major traumas. The first was during the Mississippian era when the building in which she was burned to the ground. And because she was hidden, she's probably very important in a religious ceremony, she was hidden, sort of buried in the corner. And so she made it through that. But then in the 19th century, this area was an area that was built up into stockyards, massive stockyards. And there was a sewer line and a water line that was dug that was just centimeters from destroying her. And so it's also the permanence and yet the vulnerability of objects and of our worlds and how they have a confluence. Then our third perspective is this confluence of people. People and the cultures that they came from that came into the region. And in this, my first looking at, the first way I want to look at this is in terms of hybridity. There were so many cultures in the St. Louis region very early on in the 19th century. In fact, St. Louis in the 1820s, into the 1830s had a population of 30,000, which is very large considering how distant it was to other colonial settlements or outposts. And what we see here is are two drawings, two watercolors by a young woman, Anna Maria von Pfull. She was very young. She was from Kentucky. She came out to visit her brother. And she had been trained in a ladies' academy. So sketching, sort of flower painting, sketching, painting furniture, decorating furniture were all things that would be considered proper culture for a young lady to learn. And so she brought her sketchbook with her, and she was just so taken, I think, by the different people who were in St. Louis. So on the left, you see a Creole woman. Her tinnon that she wears on her head is very associated with Creole fashion. And each woman might tie it slightly differently to sort of indicate her fashion sense or her taste. And so Anna Maria has taken very close attention to that. The same with this Masurio woman on the right. Anna Maria has been very careful to denote her necklaces, the decorations on her moccasins, the red painting that's on her cheeks and into the part of her hair, sort of noticing all these details of another woman from a different culture. And so it is this confluence of people. We see this in the hybridity of objects. And so what I show you on the left is an armoire that was made, owned by Auguste Chouteau, was made for him. And the armoires, Chouteau was Creole from St. Louis. His family was from St. Louis, one of the founding families of St. Louis, and very, very wealthy. This armoire is magnificent. If you haven't come to the show yet, if you do, it's in as I said, the very first section, and it is sort of amazing how large it is. As a matter of fact, Amy and Beth and I saw it in storage of the Missouri History Museum, and knew it was big, but it was also next to like 3 other armoires. And it was in a huge storage space. But when it came here, and it's great, I mean, we all were sort of like, oh my gosh, like it's really big. And so it is this massive piece of furniture that was very central to Creole homes. On the right, what I show you is Chouteau's house, which was the largest house in the United States at the time. And so very grand. The armoire was joined by silver, by very important publications, scientific and mechanical treatises, crystal, china, fine linens. What is hybrid about this armoire is that it was more than likely created by a French artist, probably came down into this area through Canada. And so there's a blend of, um, of of styles here. The most noticeable is probably the Bombay front and sides, which is a French style. And yet it has the Chippendale ball and claw feet that we think of with British 18th century styles. And yet it's not exactly British because those claws around the ball aren't as clearly delineated. They aren't as clearly sort of, you know, bird claws. And they also aren't as, they're thinner. And so what that is, in fact, is a sort of adjustment, a sort of Creole adjustment to this British style that you might find in New Orleans that then was also brought into this St. Louis region. So it's kind of a mix, right? It's a hybrid of all these different cultures coming out in a very creative, a material way, in an object. Another example of that is this chair. It is a child's chair that was made by William Kuntz. And Kuntz had been an enslaved laborer on a farm of a German immigrant whose name was also Kuntz, and William took his former enslaver's name when he was emancipated. Dr. Kuntz, or he was a farmer, had taught William how to make chairs. He had taught him how to make chairs, though, in the Schleswig-Holstein style, in this sort of peasant style that was from the area in Germany in which Kuntz himself had come from. And so what you see is this slat back chair. It has the woven seat, but William Kuntz has put his own twist on it. So instead of carving out of maple, he preferred hickory. He also made the seats wider, the slats somewhat, or the seat bigger, slats somewhat wider, but also you'll see these what have been called Christmas light finials. And so those are the sort of little Christmas bulb, from the 1950s, those big Christmas bulbs. And so it's sort of that shape, and that's very much Kuntz's own personality mixing in with this German style that he had been taught. Kuntz later became the postmaster in the area in Warren County in which he lived, but he still also continued to make chairs, and he must have made quite a good living at it because there are a number of them recorded in inventories and in fact still extant today. The other object that I want to look at in terms of hybridity is this Osage wedding jacket. So the Osage, when they were still located in this area, in the confluence area, and I should say that they moved out of the confluence through a region in the very early years of the 19th century. So around 1808, 1809, they had made a treaty with the US government to move further west into Buffalo Territory, which is actually bison, but we call it Buffalo Territory. But thinking, in fact, being very shrewd in thinking and realizing that the fur trade, that the animals on which the fur trade depended were becoming depleted, that styles were changing so that the demand for fur trade wasn't as great, and the Osage were the predominant indigenous traders in fur trade with the Anglo traders. And so it was in some ways a very smart move. It was brought on by Anglo encroachment into indigenous lands that had been indigenous homelands. Yet it was also the Osage thinking about, economics and the health of their nation and their people, and moving to an area that was, full of animals and hunting that had a very high demand. So anyway, but while they were in the confluence region, making a number of treaties and agreements with the US government. They would travel as a delegation, as a diplomatic delegation of a foreign nation to the United States headquarters in Washington, D.C. And as part of a diplomatic mission, they would be given gifts. And so one of the sort of common gifts would be military jackets. And so these Osage diplomats, which were male men, would come back into their homelands. And these jackets had great status because they were given as a diplomat, right, as a diplomatic gift. And so they were seen among the Osage as having great status. And they were worn not by Osage men, who tended to be more athletic and taller than Anglo men, so they didn't really fit Osage men, but rather by Osage women in their wedding ceremonies. And what you see in the photograph on the right is a married couple, and you see the wife sitting on the horse, and she has one of these jackets on, and then she has an Osage ribbon work skirt that would also been common for her wedding attire. And then often Osage women would also wear wide bands around the jacket as well. So very highly decorated. We just say we don't name who this woman is in our caption. We do know the man is Paul Albert, but Paul Albert had two wives. His first wife passed away in his second, and we're not sure which one this one is, but we do know, we have captioned it as clearly as we can to identify her. And you see on the left then with the Osage jacket that it isn't just the military jacket. It's been decorated with Osage ribbon work. It's been, the hat added to it is an incredible, colorful, celebratory image, these dyed plumes that have been put around the hat. So it's very colorful. And yet, although it is an Anglo form, the jacket has been fully incorporated into Osage traditions and into the ways in which the Osage Nation sustains its cultural integrity, its cultural history and legacy. And so these are objects that show a sense of hybridity from the confluence of people. But there are also objects in the exhibition that show or that help communities in such an area where there's such a confluence of people to sustain their identity, to sustain a community's identity in the mix of all of these different cultures. And that's a very central and important role, I think, that an object can play to a community. So for instance, the object on the right is a monstrance. It was created in in recognition of the centennial of the Jesuits coming from Maryland into St. Louis and establishing St. Stanislaus Seminary, which was in Florissant. And in 1923, in recognition of its centennial, St. Stanislaus Monastery had built a new chapel. And so by word of mouth, so this was not something that the Jesuit church decided to do. It was by word of mouth of people of its community decided to give precious metals and precious jewels out of their own personal their own personal homes and things that they had. They gifted, and then this material was, excuse me, was sent to a jeweler maker in Cleveland. But the design for this was made by William Rauscher, who was the jeweler to the papal court. So a very, a very, very historic and celebratory object for this monastery and for the Jesuit community in St. Louis, and really just absolutely incredibly magnificent. Another object similar to this is the communion chalice on the left. And this was a chalice that was brought with a group of Saxon Germans who were actually fleeing to the United States for religious freedom. In the 1830s, the different German states had joined together and had decided to have a state, essentially a state religion. And so the Lutheran religion that was different in different Lutheran communities and followed a very specific Concordia was being merged with other religious groups like Presbyterian in these German states. And so they were going to be sharing communions and sharing a concordia, sharing a practice. And so many Lutherans who did not want to do that wanted to retain their traditional forms of service and concordia. Left Germany. So they came to New Orleans first and sailed up to St. Louis, settled in Altenburg. Settled Altenburg, founded Altenburg, which is south of St. Louis, along the Mississippi River. And when they came from Saxony to the United States, there was a woman in their group who wanted to travel but was too old, and so she gifted them this chalice. It is an 18th century Polish chalice made in 1707 for a wedding, but for this group of Saxon Germans in Altenburg, it became, and still is, a symbol of an object that identifies their heritage, their continued legacy of this heritage in their community even today. It was used in communion until 1967, but it is still kept it's a different building, but in the same spot by this community, by this Lutheran community. And that brings me to talking about this audio guide again, which I encouraged you all earlier on to listen to. So what you see on the left and in the middle is the church, is Trinity Lutheran Church, the church that still has the chalice. And the church was damaged. And so damaged many years ago. And so new stained glass windows were commissioned, and one of those windows has the chalice in it, which shows its central importance. And in fact, the window below it that is not in stained glass, but is in glass, you see the church, and a storm had blown over the steeple and it destroyed, the roof and parts of the church, which is why it had to be rebuilt. And so what you see in the bottom is this sort of, I don't want to say not a tragedy, but this event, right, that destroyed the building around which this community gathers, and the chalice above it as a symbol of its continuity, I think, is a really wonderful juxtaposition. And on the very right, what you see is Caitlin Garabino, who was in our Learning and Engagement department and has moved on to a really fabulous job at the Baltimore Museum of Art. But we are interviewing Delbert and Dolores Schmidt. They are 90 and 94 years old. They have been a member of Trinity Lutheran Church, Delbert since he was born, and Dolores since she was 6 or 7. And Altenburg is a community that really until the 1980s still had a German school, still taught German in their schools. In fact, Delbert grew up speaking German and he had to learn English in school. The church still had sermons in German for many, many years. And so this German identity is very central. This identity of coming from Saxon Germany here for religious freedom is still very real to this community. And so they're talking about the church and their experiences in the chalice. And it's a really wonderful audio guide stop. So that is the end of my talk. And so I am more than happy to take any questions or comments or anything.
Thank you. Sure. Thanks, Melissa. So we don't have any questions yet, so I encourage anyone who has any, please type those in. But in the meantime, I wondered if you might talk a little bit about how this exhibition is maybe different from the ones that I know you guys have been working on this for a long time. And I wonder if you might just share a little bit of how this came together, maybe a little bit differently than others.
Sure. So we knew we wanted to do something with the bicentennial, as I said earlier. But, part of this was, so we wanted to look at a community, right? Because in some sense, that is what, a bicentennial or centennials are moments when we think about identity and history and community. But neither of us, Amy nor I nor Beth, wanted to be constrained by or limited to, or even, statehood empowers some and disempowers others, right? Creative voices and the access to creative expression. And so we wanted to look, we didn't want to be limited by that, but also, and maybe a little selfishly, we also we're, I came here 6 years ago. Amy started maybe 4 years ago, and Beth has been here 7 years. Beth is actually knew this area the best out of all three of us. But one of the things that we wanted out of the show was to make connections with other institutions that we just didn't know. We didn't know. We had never met anyone from the Washington County Historical Society or from the Lutheran Heritage Center, which is where we discovered the chalice, the Trinity Lutheran Chalice, or just every other kind of institution in the region that we should know, that we should be a network of. And, it was interesting when we would visit. On one hand, it was very flattering. People would be very excited that someone from the St. Louis Art Museum was coming out to visit, right? And on one hand, that was very lovely. But on the other hand, it's very disappointing because, I would rather be a colleague that they knew well, that when they come into St. Louis, they say, oh, Melissa, sort of like Amy and Beth and my national colleagues, or very local, St. Louis colleagues, right? It's, that we know each other well, and we work together, and we see ourselves in a network, in an artistic community. And so we really wanted to create that. And we also just wanted to think about how objects, how they function, in a community, right? And how maybe that community shares things that maybe aren't immediately noticeable. So we wanted to take a different look at these objects. In other words, how might we look at them in surprising new ways? We didn't want to do the show chronologically, because I don't know, that just didn't interest us. And it's also sort of been done. We didn't want to do it by art movements or art groups. That's also been done. There's been shows on the Osage. There's been shows on St. Genevieve Artist Colony, on, those kinds of things. So instead, we looked at it as dialogues, as, when you walk into a gallery, one of the galleries, we want you to go, oh, like, wow, that's interesting. You've got this chalice next to this bison robe, or you've got something from the Mississippian era next to a photograph, sort of like my the screen that you see right now. And so what might they have in common? What might spark, what might that spark in my own head? And I say this all the time. Poor Amy and Beth are so tired of hearing it, but we as curators, I think, have to always remind us that objects have this incredible power and that they don't really need us. It's nice to have us. We can kind of explain things sometimes and give context, but objects don't need us, nor does an audience necessarily need us. So that as curators, we have to be careful to trust the object, that it's going to have lots and lots of things it can say, that a Mississippian object doesn't have to be in only Mississippian objects. It can say an awful lot to a contemporary sculpture, right? It can say an awful lot to, I don't know, a photograph. It's just, it can talk lots of languages. It's really smart, and it does a lot of work. And that also people coming to the exhibition, y'all are really smart. You have a lot to say. You have life experiences that when you stand in front of an object, you bring things to it that, is from your life, and you are having this dialogue with this object. So one of our ideas of this exhibition was to create dialogues between objects and dialogues between people and those objects that are new and fresh and creative, and and that it's just sort of a discovery to walk through the show, and that it makes you curious. Certainly the show is grounded in sort of a curiosity on the three of ours part, to know our community, to know other objects, to find things and to discover things. And so we really want the experience of viewers, and even people listening to this series of Art Speaks talks, to share that sense, to share that experience with us.
Yeah, well, great, thank you. So we do have a few questions. Two of them actually ask a similar thing. So people are wondering if you see this type of exhibit as kind of an ongoing feature. So thinking about the future, how might you build on the relationships that you have made, and how might we see that in the museum after the show has closed, which the show actually closes, someone else asked this, the show actually closes January 9th, so it will be up until January. So yeah, just your thoughts on that.
That's a great question. And it's one that is absolutely central to why we're doing the show. I would hope that, down the road, that when communities have an art event or want to do an exhibition, that they think of us. They don't think, oh, well, St. Louis, they would never work with us or something, because it's just kind of baloney. And I'm just not that kind of curator. And that when we do something, we now know that there are these fabulous objects. Or when we go to a community, the next time I go to Herman, I'm going to look up several people there just to say hi and to see their, to talk about what their institutions are doing. In terms of exhibitions here, I hope so. This is the second exhibition of sort of this kind that I've done, and I love them. I did a show when I was still in Columbus called Objects of Wonder, where part of it was to create wonder about, this whole group of what you might think of as unrelated objects, but in their juxtapositions become related. So I did a show that was basically what's called a Wunderkammer in German, but is a cabinet of curiosities. So all of these objects from Ohio State University, from giant man-eating clamshells to birds to, contemporary art. Because I think, museums aren't art history lectures, right? I don't want to do an art history lecture here. I want to, as a curator, bring things into the space that that are able to speak to people going through. I want to be able to create that curiosity and that wonder, and to give back objects their power of fascination. I don't want to explain them so much that it's a lecture. I want them to kind of talk on their own, and to, for people going through the shows or galleries, not to feel like, oh, I don't know how to act and I don't know how to respond to this work, but that whatever labels Amy or Beth or I might write, or exhibitions that we might do, or learning and engagement programs, that are associated with the exhibitions, that what we write or do is in support of whomever's looking at the object, to be able to make a stronger connection in their own way. So I hope there are more exhibitions like this. They are not easy exhibitions. You take photographs of 3,000 objects, and then somehow you got to make sense of it, because maybe it was more Beth's expertise than certainly Amy or mine. But that's the fun of it, and I think if museums could be more about wonder and more about places in which we learn more about ourselves through looking at an object, then we're better for it as curators and as museums.
Yeah. Well, wonderful. Thank you. I think that's going to be our last question. Someone did ask, though, I do want to let people know that coming up, all of the other sections, thematic sections or rooms, so to speak, will be talked about in the coming weeks. So just wanted to say thank you, Melissa, and thanks to everyone who joined us today. So next Thursday, if you are interested, I encourage you to register for our next installment, which will be with curator Amy Torbert, who Melissa has mentioned, and she will focus on the section titled Art on Display. So I encourage you to register for that and all the subsequent programs if you're interested, and you can do that on slam.org/events. So thanks to everyone, and I hope you all have a great day.
Great, thank you.